right, good afternoon, morning. I'm going to get us started. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Hope everyone's having a good holiday season. Happy Tuesday. And we have a great session for you today. I am going to kick us off and turn it over to Kien to open us to say, what are we talking about today in our session around advancing equity and justice by connecting evaluation to strategy?
Thanks, Anand. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, maybe even good evening, depending on where you are in the world. So in philanthropy, in nonprofit, in the public sector, significant resources are spent on evaluation and on strategic planning, often two different streams of support and resources. And in the current, world we're in with the pandemic, with racial reckoning, with a lot of attention around the inequities in our society, evaluation is really working to pay more and more attention to how it can support racial equity and inform mid-course corrections for strategies, initiatives designed to effect systems change and to alleviate the inequities that communities of color and other types of communities that have been historically marginalized experience on a daily basis. On the other side, strategy, right? Similarly, more attention is being paid to what's the best way to go about addressing structural racism and engaging communities that are historically marginalized and excluded in defining the problem and designing the solution. And, this is, both streams happen, both are trying to get to the same place. And we believe that what's most valuable is for strategy and evaluation and the practitioners of both to be able to work together, because that's what's best for the communities we're trying to work in and work with, and also best for being able to affect change in the inequities in our society. But more than, often there's a divide and there's a gap, whatever you want to call it, between the strategy development and the evaluation design. And so consequently, I think we both think there's an inefficiency in the way these things are planned out and implemented. And ultimately, the impact that is often not a positive one is on the communities that we're trying to work with and work in. So really, we're trying to bridge the two. And in this webinar, talk very specifically about what it takes to bridge the two and what are some of the practical solutions. So today's takeaways are that we're going to have a macro view of evaluation, strategy, and equity and justice, talk about that evaluation strategy gap and some of the consequences and the reasons for that gap, and then really spend more time hopefully talking about the practical solutions to connect evaluation and strategy. So with that, I'm just going to say again, hello, everybody. I'm Kien Lee. I'm Principal Associate and Vice President at Community Science. My role tends to be more on the evaluation side of things, but have over the years really learned to appreciate how evaluation really should be done with the strategy development folks and team, and to support strategy development. And I will turn it over to Anand.
Thank you. My name is Anand Dholakia, Principal Associate at Community Science, and I tend to focus on the strategy development side. That's where I've traditionally focused, and I would say I have grown to appreciate the role of evaluation in strategy development and all of the learning and insights that can come from evaluation to come up with better strategy. Hence our pairing today on this webinar. And we would like to, before we get into the content, just like to hear a little bit about where you focus, right? So we appreciate your answering the registration questions, and we got some insight into your roles and where you sit. And so in the chat window, if you would please just type in which of these sides do you tend to focus on more or spend most of your time in your current role? Is it evaluation or strategy or combination? Right? So evaluation or strategy or combination. Give us a sense of where you spend your time. And Kien is going to monitor this and call out kind of the patterns that we see here. I see a combination coming up. And I am going to, while we type all of that in, see who's here, I'm going to kick us off by starting with one slide I'm going to read over, even though I'm breaking the cardinal rule of webinars, right, and presentations. I'm going to read this one slide because it's so important to both the evaluation and strategy side, and especially how we link the two together. We want to start with this grounding definition around how we see equity and justice. And we define it in this way: we will have equity and justice when people, regardless of race, first and foremost, other demographic characteristics, and place of residence, have these three things. One, fair access to opportunities and resources. Number two, the right to obtain them as respected by the law and free from discrimination. And number three, the capacity to take advantage of them, right? And that's what we start with as an anchor for bringing evaluation and strategy together in service of equity and justice. And we're going to come back to that. So with that grounding definition, I'm going to move us to, this question, again, staying a little bit high level first. What can evaluators and strategists do in our work in service of equity and justice? And turn it back to Kien.
Thanks. I was actually quickly trying to look through the responses, and it looks like we have more evaluators, or at least people who focus on evaluation, more people who focus on evaluation in the room, with a combination of some strategists and some both. So that's very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what we oftentimes, when we're talking about what evaluators and strategies can do in service of equity and justice, there are actually a lot of things we can do that are common, right? And that we can do together. From engaging communities that are most affected by the issues to actually how to collect the appropriate data that will be useful both to the strategy side and the evaluation side. And so what we're going to do today is really focus on the last bullet on the screen, which is to connect evaluation to decision-making and strategy improvement. And that's what we're going to focus on, recognizing that there are all these other aspects of the work that also inform, supports, and reinforces the connection between evaluation and strategy improvement. So what's the promise of evaluation and strategy joining forces? And there's really a lot of good things that can come out of evaluation and strategy being connected and linked, and for evaluators and the strategy team or the program team, right, working closely together. For example, one is that a strategy needs to be clear about the impact it's hoping to have. So because a strategy, especially one that is supposed to make progress towards racial equity and justice, will not likely have that impact on equity and justice overnight, it must be clear about the difference that it can make over time to get to that ultimate impact. This is where evaluation can be helpful. Evaluators can work with strategies to draft a logic model that illustrates the strategy and the theory underlying the strategy. And as much as people hate the logic modeling process and think of it as an evaluation tool, logic models really is a planning tool that helps to sharpen the strategy. And evaluators are trained to query about immediate, intermediate, and long-term outcomes, and what are the indicators of those outcomes, and help make sure that these outcomes are measurable. So they can help create a strategy that's more incremental in its impact, so that there's room for understanding the change and also making mid-course corrections. Evaluators can also help to investigate if the data for those indicators are available and accessible, especially if secondary data are needed. So if this coming together of minds doesn't happen when the strategy is being developed, here's what can happen, right? The outcomes cannot be easily measurable. The outcomes may not be the right ones, or the outcomes are too vague. And the evaluator wasn't at the table to query about those outcomes, to help unpack those outcomes so that they can be more measurable. So then if the evaluator is not at the table and he or she comes in and tries to evaluate it, maybe evaluating the wrong outcomes or developing proxy measures that are not ideal. And then the strategy may be deemed insufficient or ineffective. And then the strategy will be adjusted, but perhaps the adjustment is not the right adjustment, are not the right adjustments, or that the strategy may be terminated by leadership or board members because it was deemed as ineffective. But maybe something about it was working and it wasn't the strategy, it was the way it was evaluated. And ultimately then the communities that are supposed to benefit from the strategies are impacted, and it's, they lose. Ultimately, they're the ones that lose. Here's another benefit of evaluation and strategy joining forces. A strategy should be continuously improved based on what is being learned and evaluated. Organizations, leadership, and board members have certain times in their fiscal year calendar to make decisions about the strategy. If evaluators are at the table to fully understand and appreciate those times when decisions have to be made, they can help make explicit the progression of outcomes that would be possible to observe throughout the strategy, and then work with the strategy team or the program team to co-design the evaluation activities and products to align with the decision-making process. And if the evaluation's implementation does not support the decision-making timeline, then opportunities will be lost to use a systematic process to gather data and generate insights that will inform decisions. If decisions are not properly informed by data, inappropriate or wrong decisions will be made that could affect the communities that are supposed to benefit from the strategy. Here's a last example. Strategists, people who are developing strategies or programs often meet with grantees, community leaders, and others to better understand the challenges they face, the situation they're in, and the solutions that they think will work for their communities. And often evaluators want to do the same thing, right? They want to know what grantees or community leaders consider to be reasonable change due to the strategy. How is it that they would know that the strategy is actually making a difference, i.e., what are those indicators of change, right? And if the strategy is actually making a difference. And so both strategists and evaluators are basically trying to get a full picture of the situation from the people who know it best on the ground. If both of them are at the table to determine the questions they want to ask, the information they'd like to get, and the way they want to go about engaging grantees or community leaders in a meaningful way, it would actually be less burdensome on everybody, especially the people who are supposed to provide that information. They won't be asked twice. Hopefully they'll just be asked once, and they'll be asked for meaningful information that can inform the full scope of the work. It also helps the people who are, providing that information, sometimes grantees, sometimes just community leaders, and maybe even others, to have the full picture of the strategy and the evaluation and understand how the two are linked to support learning, mid-course corrections, and capacity building. And because this is important, because building the capacity of organizations, especially organizations that are led by people of color and or support communities of color, is a crucial component of racial equity work, right? And so without that intentional focus on building capacity through strategy and evaluation, like, we won't have the information we need to make sure that everybody has access to information and resources. So those are the three examples I could think of, Anand.
Excellent. And we're going to dig into we're working toward practical solutions to help live out this promise, to take advantage. And but first, we want to check where people are at and kind of dig into the gap that Kien was describing. And so we see that, thank you for chatting in, we see there's this interesting mix of both people who focus on evaluation and strategy, and some of you who are focusing on both. And so we want to ask you all this question. And here, not in the chat, Don Terrius is going to pop up our poll, our Zoom poll, and we're going to ask you this, right, is how closely do your evaluation and strategy functions in your organization work together or not work together, right? And the scale of 1 to 5. 1 is not at all. And people started to answer before I even said the scale. Okay, 1 is not at all, and 5 is fully integrated. You are 1. How about that? Your evaluation strategy are 1, and then 1 is not at all. So 5, 1,
Yeah,
5 in there.
sorry. If you can't see the poll, just type in your rating in the chat.
Type
That's
in your
fine.
answer.
We're looking at it. It's been mainly like 2s and 3s, 2.5s. We do have 1.5, which is pretty exciting, which means the strategy team and the evaluation team work really closely together. The rest have been around 2s and 3s, so which is a little bit, but not that much, right? And there's a comment from somebody about how the problem isn't with our internal function, but clients come to us for evaluation and then have a then we have to backtrack into the strategy. And that's the problem, right? That's exactly the problem, because evaluators are not at the table when the strategy is happening. And then, yes, speaking as an evaluator, then you have to be backtracking and going, what were you trying to do in the first place? Yeah.
Right. So thank you everyone for participating in the poll and the chat. Definitely 2 out of the scale of 1 to 5, 2 is the most popular answer, and 3 is the second. And so yes, Kien said I think the official conclusion is the technical term for where that is.
Anand, sorry, that's a question. Anand, there's a question actually that's relevant to this, exactly what we're talking. There's a question about when we're talking about strategy, are we talking about development or program implementation, or both? And it's really both, right? Because it's about designing the program and what you're trying to change with the program. But it's also, when we're talking about how does a program unfold? So I think it's a little bit of both. But I think more the focus is on the front end, because if you don't get the front end of it right, then the rest may not follow. So I think Anand and I really trying to get in front of the situation, which is like in the design phase of any strategy, any program, any evaluation, like we should all be working together on the front end.
It's way more efficient at that point. To make sure that the programs that are being designed and implemented, and then all the resources going into evaluating them, that it's much more efficient to make sure that the strategy made sense in the first place, right? In our working in service of equity and justice. And so, but it's definitely not a one-time upfront thing, but more of a continuous ongoing focus. And we're going to get into exactly that a little bit more and show you exactly what we're talking about. So thank you all for participating. And I think what we see here in the results and in the chat are what we know to be this gap between evaluation and strategy. You just helped us quantify it. And we're going to dig in a little bit before we go to the practical solutions. One thing we want to do first is, as a good strategist and good evaluators, is dig into the root causes of the gap. Right? We want to first specify, well, what does this gap actually look like, and why is it there? Right? What's keeping this gap in place that keeps evaluation and strategy so separate in day-to-day life in our roles? And so we've highlighted a number of things to dig into, a number of dynamics that exist between evaluation and strategy to dig into. The first one is, I think it's more often than not, it's separate teams that are conducting their separate processes, completely distinct and siloed from each other. Right? There's strategy people who are working on making those decisions and developing that, maybe with separate consultant, separate modes of getting input and data, and then evaluation on its side has its own, all of that, right, operating separately and oftentimes not at the same time, right? Strategy will be developed and fleshed out first, that's the whole thing, and evaluation is brought on later toward the end, as we just kind of described. I'll go to Kien, talk about the threat of evaluation.
Yeah, well, I think most oftentimes people perceive evaluation as being a threat, right, and punitive. It's part of the job hazard here. And so I think that, so I think on program side, on strategy side, often not wanting to engage the evaluation until as far along as possible, right? Like the avoidance. And so that's part of the issue. It's just that evaluation is seen that way rather than being seen as what I've heard my colleagues call it, that the friendly critique or a critical friend kind of thing, where we're really helping to inform the strategy, helping to learn, and helping to advocate for the strategy to be successful, right? I mean, that doesn't mean we're more biased. Whatever strategies, we would want it to be successful. But if it's not successful, it's our job to help explain why. So there is that threat of the evaluation. Whether it's real or not, it's there. Strategic planning trap.
I'm going to say, yeah, so on the strategy side, I can say, and I've put out some content around this describing at least 7 traps that most strategic planning processes fall into. And one of them to highlight for this context is that I've seen a lot of strategy development start with the answer already in mind before the process even starts. And typically it's, some solution, some silver bullet solution very often is centered at the beginning, and then the entire process is around, okay, how do we build out this solution, this magic solution that's going to solve everything? And more often than not, that solution is narrowly defined and not always working in service of equity and justice, as Kien had talked about, things to watch out for previously. And that's one. Another trap is this emphasis on quantification, right? Is having strategies where an organization, it can be a foundation, it could be a nonprofit organization, is looking to have this discretely quantifiable impact in exactly 2, 3, 5 years, and that impact can be 100% attributed to that organization, right? And all of that sets up, the last trap I'll say is just this assumption that longer term systemic outcomes that we know are important for equity and justice cannot be evaluated, cannot be measured. There is that standing assumption or misunderstanding that all of that can and does be measured and evaluated. And so all of that, then those traps lead to strategies that are kind of looking in on themselves and serving other purposes than serving equity and justice, and evaluation is left to the side, right? The results of evaluation you're only looking at the results that are relevant to the answer you already came up with, which I kind of call as, putting the cart before the horse. It could be, we're developing solutions that are then looking for a problem to solve. I'm going to go, there's myths about evaluators.
Yeah, I think this one, this is a typical one we hear, right? That like if the evaluator gets too close to the program team or the strategy team or, the quote unquote intervention, then the evaluation risks being biased because then it has an agenda about that particular strategy or program, whether we want it to succeed or not. Like we have biases, and that means that the evaluation becomes less rigorous, which means that the results won't be accurate and no one's going to believe it. So I think that's a myth, but yet I think in this world where we're working towards racial equity and justice, the outcome is not going to be, the outcome of equity is not going to be achieved anytime soon. And so I think it's really important that in the work towards equity and justice, I think someone put this in the chat, that quote unquote, although if we conceptualize a strategy as adaptive, basically based on learning, then design and planning can continue to occur in parallel, which means both strategy teams and the strategy team and the evaluation need to be working closely to ensure that insights are generated to inform mid-course adjustments to the strategy so that we can all get better and better at fighting racial inequity and injustice and being able to dismantle structural racism. So that doesn't mean that you're, as the evaluator, that doesn't mean that, we're less objective. It just means that we have to have a systematic inquiry process that has integrity, transparency in how we determine the data to be collected, how we collected the data, how we analyze it, and how we're reporting it. The notion of a value-free evaluator is just, it doesn't exist. None of us are value-free. We're human beings. We can't be free of our values. So this myth is another one that causes the gap, because then what happens is somebody has a program and a strategy, they're developing it, and then when it's all set in stone, let's bring the evaluator in. And I've run into situations where the people who are implementing the program, sometimes the foundation has program partners who are implementing the program, and those program partners weren't at the table to help select the evaluator. And then what happens is, they find the evaluator coming in on behalf of the funder and having this quote unquote heavy hand to judge their work. So that's the other situation that causes the gap, I think.
So you're highlighting a combination of dynamics that are keeping us apart and preventing us from joining forces. I think, and we're seeing that there's a number of root causes, mindsets, myths that are driving, that are keeping this gap in place. I think we also need to call out the issues on each of our sides, where each of our sides can do things differently that can help make the connection stronger. I'm going to call out the evaluation side and typical evaluation approaches, which makes it really hard for strategic planning to digest anything that evaluation comes up with. And so, for an example, I pulled up Kien's latest evaluation report of one program, and we do not have time to digest this entire thing and the 200 pages of numbers in that to inform our strategy development. Don't have time.
That was not a report. Did you say that was my report?
Yes.
That is a lie.
It's not. This is my wife's.
I totally agree with you there, Anand. I do think that one of the downsides is that evaluators produce highly technical reports that requires the reader or the strategist to go in, sift through all that information, and then figure out, okay, how can I use this information to, what does this mean for my strategy, for my program? And that is a problem, all right? And so I'll admit that evaluators who write highly jargony technical reports that are not useful is a problem, and that creates the gap. On the other hand, I think that if evaluators and strategies can work together, and the strategies can be clear about what information they need and when, right? And what kinds of products, because sometimes you want a technical product to speak to a particular audience. Sometimes you don't need that technical product to speak to a different audience. Like being clear about that upfront and having communication strategy, actually, speaking of strategy, a different type of strategy, but the communication side of things to be integrated into the process early on. I hope that will get us all to a better place where the products developed by the evaluator would be useful and can speak to different kinds of audiences.
You don't have any complaints about strategists, do you?
Don't have any complaints about strategists. I feel that my experience has been that strategists often see evaluation as a threat. And they look at, and I struggle with why strategists don't see the logic model as a planning tool. Because what I've seen in the room is like, a strategy team creating a strategy, and then I get this, great illustration of the strategy. And then meanwhile, I'm the evaluator creating the logic model. And then when I put them side by side, they're not that different. Maybe in the logic model that the evaluator creates, the outcome is like at the end, right, of the right side of the diagram, whereas the strategy puts the outcome as the objective on the left side of the diagram. But we're all essentially trying to get to the same place. So I guess, why wouldn't strategies actually see evaluation and logic modeling as supportive of their work rather than a threat?
I will admit to that, because we are in the business of being creative, visionary, making things up. And literally, I'm quoting strategists I've worked with. We are in the business of making things up and And evaluation doesn't fit with that. It's too, it puts handcuffs on it. And what's great about the strategy development business is you can put out these visionary goals and hand the strategy over. And what happens after that is the evaluator's problem, and the client will kind of hire them 3 years later when it's done.
Yeah. And so then, so then garbage in, garbage out, right? The strategy was not a strong one or a powerful one in the first place to get to racial equity. And then suddenly the evaluators brought in to create some magic with the data to show that it's impactful on racial equity. So that goes.
True. Yeah, no argument there. So
sorry, Anand, Anand, I'm watching the chat, and I think someone just said that, like, that the logic model should be created in partnership together with the strategy and the evaluator. Absolutely, that should be done with the program or strategy team at the table. I don't think evaluators should try and create logic model on their own at all. Yeah. Definitely.
And I should say maybe vice versa. The strategy people should not try to create it without the evaluation people in the room, and sooner rather than later. I want to note there was one question about how to make the case for bringing in evaluation earlier rather than at the end, given time and budget constraints that strategy processes may have. How about, can we hold on that till the Q&A?
Yeah,
because that's a good one. That's a big one. So you all, we've just gave you a little insight into Kien's and my lunch conversations sometimes, but we are on the same side. This is not a battle, and so we are going to look to, now that we've dug into the gap a little bit, what to do about it. All right, and so first we're going to look at a high-level framework in terms of a way of thinking about how the two sides can work together to address this gap. And I'll be still tracking questions for after that, and then we'll get to practical solutions.
So one of the ways to close this gap is through what we call the learning and continuous strategy improvement. And this focuses on learning and focuses on strategy adjustments along the way, because, the point is that no strategy would be perfect right from the beginning, right? Strategies are based on hypotheses, on theories, on existing information, and ideally we should be testing that. So the learning and continuous strategy improvement really is made up of a series of steps in the process. And we will start with the first box, right? That's the planning process. And again, this is where hopefully the strategists and the evaluators are working together. During the planning process, ideally, in order to get to, an outcome or an impact of equity and justice, you're applying a systems lens and making explicit assumptions. Systems change is hard, and assumptions, that we often make a lot of assumptions underlying what we believe the change should look like and how we would unfold. So making that explicit upfront is really helpful, because it will help test those assumptions in the evaluation process. So in this step, what you have to do is learn about systems, the levers of change, and the power dynamics to inform that theory of change. So Anand, I don't know if there's a lag, but if you can just keep clicking, right? So so this is where the just sort of that information gathering upfront is helpful. So a strategist has an idea about what they're trying to change, how they think the change should unfold. They have their own information, but strategists don't always have, the skills for data collection, or for doing focus groups, or for doing interviews. And this is where an evaluation partner can be helpful. That's how evaluators are trained to do those things. So they can come in and work with strategies to say, what do you want to learn about systems? What do you want to learn about levers of change? And help do an assessment, or help do focus groups or interviews in order to collect that information to strengthen the theory of change that's already in the strategist's mind. And so then in the next step, right, then you're taking all that information and you're designing the strategy and you're improving upon it. And so you're determining, okay, at this stage, well, what does it take to implement the strategy and what can we expect? This is the honing the theory of change, the logic model, the evaluation questions. This is honing all of that. This is the stage where the evaluator can work with the strategy team to say, okay, what are the outcomes you expect over time? What is it you're trying to learn from this? What are the questions you want answered? And how do we go about measuring this change process? Then the next step is that you're implementing the strategy, you're collecting information for process outcomes. And so, oftentimes the theory is always great, the strategy might be great, but implementation can be flawed for all kinds of reasons, right? From capacity needs or capacity challenges to what's happening in our environment and our context. So, here's where the evaluator can work with the strategy team to monitor implementation and to look at what are those milestones and what are those process outcomes from implementation that they can collect, provide real-time feedback, adjust, and then improve the likelihood of achieving the outcomes, which then leads to the outcomes. And this is where I think the evaluation team and the strategy team can work closely to say, well, what outcomes are we intending to impact? And then maybe there are unintended outcomes that we know might happen, and the evaluator should try and collect that information. There might also be unintended consequences. The strategy may not impact everything like all good stuff. Bad stuff could come out of it that we may not even be aware of, but it's important to understand that. And then what is helping to create that change? Is it just a strategy, or is it something else happening? And these are conversations useful to have early on with the strategy and the evaluation team at the table. And then together, you're interpreting the findings, you're learning from the findings, you're discussing the implications for improvement, and then figuring out how you're going to, what is the line of accountability, because there's going to be some reporting you have to do back to leadership, to board, and be accountable for the investment. So really together figuring out like, okay, what is it that we're learning here? What's the so what, right? And how do you then go back to redesigning, improving the strategy? So last click, I think Anand will get the arrow back. So there's a feedback arrow that goes back to design and improve. There we go. So this is where I think, early on in the process, and then at the end of the process, the coming together of the two minds are really important. In the middle is just clarity about how to efficiently streamline the work and when you come together. So this is the process. And then I'm just going to get into the next slide that speaks specifically about the first box. Often when we're trying to create a strategy in service of racial equity and justice, the strategy side right here, and then here's a little thing about strategy people, like they get there and they're like, we want community change, we want systems change, right? But they don't get deep into like, what are you trying to change and for whom, right? And the evaluators sometimes try and dig into that, but sometimes, like I think someone pointed this out in the chat, right? The evaluators being hired right after the strategy is done, and then they get this great documents that said like, yeah, we want community change, we want change in this, and then the evaluators go collect data, and then you got to go like, what data am I collecting, from whom, why, all this stuff, and then you have to back paddle to like, what is the strategy really focus on, what's it trying to do? And so these questions are important in the beginning for both parties to sit at the table and discuss, what's unfair and unjust and for whom, right? What are the root causes of the disparities? What is it in the systems that we need to change? What are those levers of change? Who has the power to push and pull those levers? And where does power need to shift? And this is important because evaluation is not apolitical. Evaluations occur in often a political environment because it generates information and knowledge, which is then power. So having that discussion earlier on about like, yeah, who holds the power to make decisions? How does the evaluator work with the strategy team to shift power and advance equity? Does not make it any less rigorous, does not make it any biased. It's all about how does the evaluation and strategy work together towards the common goal of impacting equity and justice. So with that, I'm going to pause.
Yeah, I want to just build on that with one point, is that we spend a lot of time trying to emphasize that it is possible to recognize the big picture, the big systemic picture of equity and justice, recognize systemic racism, and also still be rigorous. but in both strategy and in evaluation, and be able to track it and show impact. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding around that leads to a lot of wasted resources, and equity and justice suffer as a result. And Kien talked about that earlier. I'm gonna go to, because we have a number of questions around the shifting of mindsets and shifting of resources to allow this to happen, and around the greater understanding on each side of the other side, and transferring experience and skills. I see a central theme there. We're just going to go through. How about we'll go through just a few practical solutions for implementing this framework, bringing the two sides together, and then we'll take on everything that we have time for. So solutions, two at a time, right? And here are some things that are places to start, right? And things that need to be in place as concretely as we could define them. And so what we have is on the left, a solution. Here, as in where are we at now? What's the current state of things? There, as in where would you want to get to that would help bridge this gap? And then finally, how to get from here to there, right? What are the steps to take? Or what are the things to put in place? And so I'll take on these first two. Number one, as we started out right at the beginning, is to center equity and justice as the ultimate goal, and I should say the shared goal, right? That everyone's on the same team, and ensuring that everyone is working toward that common goal at the same time. Right now, we know that there's inconsistent centering of equity and justice on both sides, not both slides, both sides, and varying goals, right? Depending on how did the strategy and evaluation processes come about, who was leading them, right? And what other agenda was there behind it. There would be, this goal is a shared anchor for both processes. And how to get from here to there is applying that a shared systems lens where both strategy and evaluation people are applying the same lens equally, and both are explicitly focusing on structural racism and the other things we know that are related, that are essential to focus on when focusing on equity and justice. So that's right at the top, and it comes first for a reason. Second solution is to align the team structure and process. We heard how separate this is. And so what do we have here? Silo teams and meetings and such. What could be good to aim for is you can still keep those separate meetings. Those still need to happen, but then also bring in combined team meetings. And to ensure that those work, well, they have to be scheduled first of all, but then second is to make sure that those meetings are successful, with evaluation and strategy people in the same room to start those conversations, making sure there's clear meeting agreements, right? And clear agendas that are being explicit about both roles of evaluation and strategy, right? And so in those meetings, people are knowing, how they are being facilitated, and the content, what to do when disagreements, right, or different points of view come up, and knowing and at least agreeing on how to address those. And taking that on deliberately. Yeah, we'll move to the next set of solutions. Kien.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to build on what Anand said really quickly too. Okay. I mean, this whole idea of evaluation and strategy coming together, it's also something that we are supposedly practicing in developmental evaluation. For those evaluation professionals in the room, I mean, developmental evaluation is about this, right? Where you're trying to adapt the strategy, and that means that the strategy team needs to be at the table. And one of the reasons for the gap is that people don't fully understand the expectations of developmental evaluation. And so we have people who say we want that, but then the strategy team's like, I don't have time to be involved in it. But yet wanting the developmental evaluation means they have to be involved in it as much as the evaluator is involved in it. So I just want to add that, and then consequently, well, not consequently, the underlying problem is that the budget is not set up on the program or strategy side and the evaluation side to be able to accommodate the amount of relationship building, trust building, and meetings that need to happen in order to bring the two together and adapt continuously. So I just wanted to build on that point. Sorry, Anand, the next slide. I know that we actually don't have a lot of time and we want to leave some room for questions. So I think the products and deliverables are obvious. It is really for the evaluation team to be really clear about when decisions are needed and to be able to work with the strategy team to co-develop a schedule for the evaluation that will align with some of those decision making, so that the deliverables or the products are available when decisions are needed, and being clear about the format, right? If it's something that needs to be quick, you're not trying to create an exhaustive, 40-page report, but hey, maybe you just need 2 pages so that there's some synthesis of the situation. Thanks, Anand. A synthesis of the situation so that decisions can be made. The other part that I think is important is just the clarity of team capacities, roles, and expectations. One of the things I will say about from the evaluation side is that evaluation professionals are not necessarily trained in facilitation, or even understanding organizational change. So often what happens, the shortcoming there's like the evaluators like making all these recommendations, but not fully appreciating the context in which those recommendations have to be, have to go up the chain of command or have to be institutionalized, and what needs to change inside the organization in order for those recommendations to be realized. So I think just building that capacity on the evaluation is important. I think on the strategy side, I think not fully understanding evaluation either, or the language. That's it. I mean, language is a big one, right? Like we speak different languages. And so how do you even have that time early on to level set the language that we're all speaking, because we're all trained in different ways. And so, if you say this, I mean this. If you say that, I mean this. Like just having that process. So building that capacity ahead of time is important. I think that's as much as I'll say for now.
Yep, and someone noted exactly this. Exactly what we're talking about is kind of evaluation strategy of valuations, understanding of strategy, and I will claim the same, right? Strategy is about understanding evaluation. Last slide, and we'll get to Q&A. So really quickly, I think this solution around coordinating stakeholder engagement, Kien already described around how strategy and evaluation may go about it completely separately in terms of getting input from stakeholders. That's community residents, it can be people in positions of power, it does whatever it is, and be doing it completely distinctly. There can be overlap, duplication, working towards separate goals, even though people should be on the same page. And so coordinating that's the solution, and having hopefully those meetings, aligned meetings can help provide the venue to do that. And lastly is this, it's the administrative kind of mundane issue of service contract processes. And though it's very important, and in looking at the timing and the flexibility of what those contracts are set up to do, so that strategy and evaluation contracts are not taken on completely separately, kind of following on this same theme. And so the solution is to have that deliberate conversation with contracts officers, and before that, in just setting it up to make sure that, right, this work is being aligned and not taken on in 2 separate worlds. It just follows on all of the things we've shown so far. We can jump to Q&A. Kien, anything last to add here before we do that?
No, thanks. Nope, I don't. I mean, I grabbed 2 questions already in the Q&A. I mean, the Q&A have the questions, so maybe we can just get straight there.
Yeah, let's do that. So this is a big one. I think this has come up, multiple people have brought this up, is the time, and you said it, that right, time and budget constraints often in the strategy process that don't account for evaluation, because we assume the evaluator will be brought on 4 years later and it will be long out of the picture, right? So how to create the buy-in, right? And the shift in mindset, and to see, for organizational leadership to see the value of evaluation, right? See it as important in strategy and do it sooner.
You want me to take a shot at that?
You can go first.
I think that evaluations and need to be positioned as a support for learning and for strategy improvement, and not this independent thing on the side, to really determine, whether or not the strategy is a thumbs up or thumbs down. And I think it's often seen as that. And in the work around racial equity and racial justice, more and more it cannot be about thumbs up, thumbs down. It has to be more and more about learning and adapting and getting better at it, because we don't have the perfect strategy to dismantle structural racism. What we know is certain things work, but context is a really important element in whether something works or not. And so what we have to continuously do is learn to get better at it under the circumstances we're working in, and the conditions we need to work in. So that evaluation really should be positioned as part of learning and support to learning and in service of it. I think that's important, right? I will say with a caveat that not all evaluators have the ability to do that. So, identifying the right evaluator that can design an evaluation in service of learning, in order to get to racial equity, is important, because that's not how the whole field is positioned, or that everybody as an evaluator is trained. So that is something to consider.
Yeah, and I'll edit. I do see it as a two-step process. I think one is definitely shifting mindsets to look at the reality of equity and justice and what's required to achieve it, to change systems, and that's on both sides. I think a lot of strategy development has focused on short-term, narrowly defined programmatic solutions, as I talk sometimes silver bullet solutions, as I talked about before, and that lends itself to, and that is coupled with a traditional way of going about strategy, which is just to write a strategic plan, right? And that's sometimes at a very high level with a lot of ambiguity. So none of that lends itself to working closely with evaluation in the way that Kien is describing. If it does, right, if evaluation comes along later, it's typically to put this stamp of approval on a program. It's yes, it's evidence-based, it works, or no, or it's not, right? It's kind of all or nothing. And so I think first part is building awareness around that in the appropriate ways. And then second is shifting the mindset around evaluation, in that it's not just about that 3-year retroactive thing, right? But this is about continuous learning improvement of the strategy, shifting the mindset about what evaluation can do in a developmental way, ongoing learning. What there's to build on, I'll say, is that there is focus on continuous learning and improvement. It's just not associated with evaluation all the time, right? So people, when developing strategy and then implementing programs, will think about performance measurement, tracking data, right, refinement, but it's not, evaluation is often associated with this separate bucket, right, that comes later. So we have about 2 minutes left, but I think in terms of creating buy-in, it does come down to, I think, a lot of communication, showing examples and case studies of how the two can work together could be useful. And this is stuff we've done, right? Like Kien and I have done in client situations, in working with partners, is to try to make that argument. Kien, are you tracking? Let's see, what else do we have? There was a follow-up. Oh no, that was Kien. That was your follow-up about lean change management.
Yeah. Jill just sent a link to a website about lean change management. And so I was just actually looking at it quickly because I didn't want to assume I understood what it meant. So yeah, and I'm still reading through it. So while I'm doing that, and I'm happy to speak to you separately about it as well. Jill, I think that the other comment here was just about, well, it was one comment about, somebody said, I've experienced where the group in the room who develops a theory of change or logic model benefits from the discussion and shared experience developing the model, but then those not in the room find the model overwhelming or not helpful. And that's so true. We just literally came back from a meeting where we had to break down a complex idea into almost like a logic model, which then got very complex. But then the people who are outside of that room can't understand it. So in that situation, the solution was really you got to kind of have two versions of it. One that is simple enough that someone who's not in the room can see what you're trying to do with the strategy and the underlying assumptions. And then one that perhaps the evaluator has that unpacks it a little bit more so that those outcomes and those indicators of change are clearly delineated and then can be tracked. So that's just in response to that. And I don't know if Anand, you have another response to that.
I am just going to note that we are at time. And so I will just in honoring people's time, we can come back to that. And then I think there's at least one or two more questions. If you can stay on a little long. I have a few more minutes, but I'm going to at least just bring up this last slide. And so to leave people with, and we'll send out the recording. So for anyone who's interested in digging in further, where our info is on here, we're going to point you to two sets of resources, one around evaluation, doing evaluation in service of racial equity, brand new 3-part series of practice guides available on the W.K. Kellogg Foundation website, and the link is there, and a slightly older but still very recent guide to philanthropic strategy that advances equity and justice, about trying to reinvent strategy to do better. It's targeted toward foundations, but a lot of the principles are universally applicable, available on our website. The link is here. So for anyone who needs to leave, thank you so much for spending your time with us and taking out your afternoon, especially during this holiday season. And for anyone who wants to go, wish you the best, rest of your day and week and holiday season, and Happy New Year. And I'll type my email in there too. And for anyone who can stay on for a minute or two, I think we can take on the last question or two. And
sorry, Anand, it was just good. I wasn't typing my email in there as well, but it's just that my email's wrong on the slide. So it's just my first name at communiscience.com.
Good to know.
Yep.
Yes, Kien at communityscience.com, please. Everyone, and we'll correct that in the in what goes out later. And I think on the question of lean, it was change management was the last one, and
it's lean change management. So that's a
specific. Lean management.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have Jill's email address, so we can always have an offline.
You'll follow up around there. Great. Maybe I think the last question I would highlight, and I think it's for, it's both of us, but it's this point a few times about evaluation, the evaluation side needing to benefiting from understanding more about the strategy process and understanding how that works. Yeah. Do you want to reflect on that one? And here I can find
not having the tools. I agree. I think logic models tend to be very static, and so it doesn't fully capture well the strategy side. And I think that's an opportunity for strengthening some tools and the practice of evaluation in the evaluation profession. Certainly true.
Yeah, and I'll say on the strategy side, I've definitely developed logic models and theories of change as part of a strategic plan, often enough, and so it's not like it's not 100% separate, but definitely as a consumer of evaluation results, right? I think strategy development, strategy people can be more avid consumers of evaluation what comes out of evaluation processes if they are formatted and targeted for that purpose, right? And so I think that means that, a different type of report, a different type of presentation, et cetera, which I could think can all come out of, knowing how that, having more insight into how that process happens, right? So I think it's individual tools and then also formatting, et cetera. I think we are good to go. Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all. We will follow up with the video of this. Have a great rest of the day and the week.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for
Signing off.
participating.